The day that changed his life began like hundreds of others. Alexei Efremov, a senior lieutenant in the fire department, was drinking strong coffee in the small duty room and looking out the window where snow was lazily falling. In the radio sounded a dry message about a fire in a 5-story building on Lesnaya Street. "The call is accepted," he threw to the dispatcher, and grabbing his helmet, ran to the car. By the time they arrived, the building was already engulfed in flames. Thick smoke was billowing from the windows of the 3rd floor, and screams were coming from the upper floors. The situation was getting worse by the second. "There are people inside," shouted an elderly woman, pointing at the windows. "There are girls in there. There are 5 of them." Alexei gritted his teeth. There was no time. He and his partner Nikolai made their way through the front door, but thick smoke obscured the view. The temperature was rising, but his instincts and experience drove him forward. Suddenly, a child's cry. He found them at the end of the corridor. 5 girls huddled together, shielding their faces from the smoke. The oldest was no more than 10. They were scared, but Alexei knew they couldn't delay. "Everything will be all right, girls, one at a time." The fire roared like a living thing, but Alexei led them out of the apartment without losing control. One of the beams cracked, but he closed the girls with him. Blood dripped onto the floor. Once outside, he handed them over to the medics, feeling weakness engulf his body. And at that moment, the older girl, thin, with crying eyes, clutched at his sleeve. "Uncle Fireman, don't go away." These words had embedded themselves in him deeper than the burns he had received in that scorcher, and he didn't leave. Alexei couldn't get that voice out of his head, high, trembling, filled with fear, but with some unexpected hope. A girl with short, slightly curly blonde hair looked up at him. Her eyes reflected the glow of the burning house. "Uncle Fireman, don't go." There was chaos all around. Ambulances, firemen, neighbors shouting something incomprehensible to each other. Alexei groped the wound on his shoulder. The blood had already soaked the sleeve of his uniform. The pain was bearable, but something clenched in his chest. He looked at the girls again. The smallest, about 4 years old, with eyes as dark as coal, was shivering with cold. The middle one, short and pigtailed, was still coughing, trying to catch her breath. The other 2 were clinging tightly to each other, their parents. Alexei turned to the neighbors. People were talking in low voices, some shaking their heads. He caught a worried look from one of the nurses. "They were found alone in the apartment," she explained. "The parents weren't home. That sounded like a blow." "What about them now?" Alexei forced himself to speak evenly. "For now, to the hospital, to be examined. And then, most likely, an orphanage." The words echoed in his head. An orphanage. He looked at them again. Homeless. Orphaned. 5 little girls whose lives had just nearly been cut short in a fire. Alexei suddenly felt furious. Why were they even alone? Where are their parents? Can I go with them? Not expecting such a question from himself, he looked at the nurse. She blinked in surprise but nodded. Just for a little while. The ambulance smelled of medicine and fumes. The girls were huddled together, and the eldest, Katya, still wouldn't let go of his hand. "Uncle," she whispered. "Alexei," he corrected her gently. "You're not leaving, are you?" He wanted to say something reassuring, but the words stuck in his throat. "I won't." But could he really do anything for them? The hospital smelled of antiseptic and anxiety. The girls were placed in the children's ward. The doctors fussed around them, and Alexei stood at the door, not knowing what to do next. He realized that soon the guardianship authorities would come for them, and that would be the end of it. He's just a firefighter, not a relative, not a guardian, just an ordinary man who had saved 5 children from the fire. But when Katya looked at him again, tiredly, pleadingly, Alexei felt he couldn't just walk away. "Listen," he intercepted the doctor, who was writing down the data. "These girls, what will happen to them next?" The woman looked at him tiredly. "We've already notified the child welfare authorities. They're here for now, and then, you know how it is, how it happens." Alexei knew. He'd grown up in an orphanage himself. That thought burned worse than the recent fire. He ran his palm over his face, feeling the soot on his skin. Part of his mind was screaming, "Stay out of it! It's none of your business! It's not your life!" But could he just turn away? At that moment, Katya timidly tugged at his sleeve. "You're not going to leave us?" Alexei swallowed. "Non bother." When he got home, to the small 2-room apartment that was always in order, his mind was in chaos. He sat on the couch, staring at the ceiling. "You can't just adopt 5 kids," his mind said. "What if you could?" The heart objected. The next day, he was back in the hospital, and as the caseworkers began the paperwork, he said something that shocked everyone, including himself. "I want custody, paperwork, interviews, endless background checks, trials." Alexei went through hell, which was harder than a burning house. He was proving that he could be a father, that he could handle it, that the girls were not strangers to him. Every night, he went to the pediatric ward of the hospital where they waited. And when, after a few months, he finally received official authorization, the girls ran out to meet him, and Katya whispered, "I knew you wouldn't leave." And so their new life began. Alexei, accustomed to silence and strict order, suddenly found himself in a house full of laughter, crying, talking. He was learning to be a father from scratch. He learned to braid pigtails, to help with lessons, to deal with children's offenses. But most importantly, he realized that his life would never be the same again. Alexei was never afraid of difficulties. In his work, everything depended on equanimity and calculation. A step to the left, a step to the right, and you might not come back. But being a father, this was a territory for which there were no instructions. From the very first days, it was clear. Life alone and life with 5 girls are 2 different worlds. The first night he brought them home, it became clear that they all had fears. Katya, as the eldest, tried to pretend that everything was under control, but at night, she woke up with nightmares. The middle one, Anya, was silent, hardly speaking, only watching him with her big gray eyes. The smallest, 4-year-old Olya was afraid to sleep alone and quietly crept into his room, clinging to his arm like a lifeline. Alexei was not ready for this. For the first week, he felt like a firefighter who found himself in the middle of a raging element without a hazmat suit. "You should have thought of that earlier," his friend Nikolai muttered when he came to visit him, and found the apartment in chaos. Scattered toys, children's jackets, plates of uneaten porridge. Alexei sighed tiredly. "You think I didn't?" "Non bother. You always jump into the fire without thinking." "Maybe so," Alexei grinned. "But you know what I didn't expect?" "What?" "That I'd like it." Nikolai hummed. watching little Olya, with a serious face, building something out of cubes on the carpet. Well, well, let's see what you say in a month. A month later, Alexei realized that his friend was right. Life had turned upside down. It all started when Katya decided that she should take on the role of hostess. "I'll help," she said firmly when Alexei tried to make breakfast himself. "Katya, you're 10 years old," he reminded her tiredly. "I know how," she objected. "That's fine," Alexei grinned. "Then tell me, what's wrong with this pancake?" Katya took the plate, looked intently at the burnt piece of dough, then at him. "Dad, it's not a pancake. It's a crime." He blinked. "Dad?" Katya flared up, averted her eyes. "Well, yes. Can we do that?" Alexei felt something inside him turn upside down. "Yes," he answered quietly. The girls slowly began to get used to their new home, but each of them had her own fear. Anya was afraid of loud noises. When firecrackers exploded in the street, she froze, clenching her fists. Masha, a 6-year-old prankster, was constantly testing the boundaries of what was allowed. She could climb on a cupboard and then pretend she didn't know how to get off. Sonia, 7 years old, could not get used to the fact that now she has her own closet, her own bed, that things do not need to be hidden. And Olya was just afraid to be alone. Alexei wasn't a psychologist. He just did what he could. He'd tell Anya that loud noises weren't scary, and then he'd turn up the music louder, dancing with her in the kitchen. He'd put Masha on his shoulders and run around the apartment until she started laughing. He covered Sonia with a blanket every night and left the nightlight on. And Olya he just hugged when she woke up in fear. And one day, in the middle of the night, when she once again crawled into his bed, she whispered, "You're not going to give us up again, are you?" Alexei sighed, stroked her hair. "No, baby girl, never. But trouble always comes unexpectedly." That day, Alexei received a summons to appear in court. The girls' parents had come forward, and now they wanted them back. Alexei read the summons over and over again, as if he hoped that the letters on the paper would add up to some other, less terrible message. The girls' parents showed up. They wanted their children back. My first thought was, no, they won't take them. Second, why the hell did they even show up just now? He remembered carrying them out of the fire, how they had sat on the cold pavement, shivering with fear and cold, all alone. Where were those very parents then? Why didn't they rush into the fire for their children? Why didn't they come to the hospital? Why had they kept silent all these months? Alexei clutched the sheet tightly, feeling anger rising inside. "What happened, Dad?" He raised his head. Katya stood in the doorway, slightly frowning her eyebrows. "Nothing," he answered too sharply. Katya was not stupid. "It's about us, isn't it?" He was silent, not knowing how to tell her the truth. Katya looked at him with a long, probing gaze, then asked quietly, "Do they want to take us away?" Alexei sighed. "Listen, Katya." "No," she interrupted. "Just say it." Alexei ran her hand over her face. "Yes." She clenched her fists. "We don't want to go to them." "I know. They abandoned us." There was anger in her voice, but even more fear. "They left us, and now they want us back?" "Katya, no! We don't want to go back to them. You won't let us, will you?" He looked at her. A 10-year-old girl who'd grown up too soon. A girl who was ready to protect her sisters, even if she was torn with fear. "I will fight," Alexei said firmly. I won't give you up." The trial lasted several months. The girl's parents appeared accompanied by lawyers. The mother looked exhausted. The father hardly spoke. Their lawyers insisted that the children had been left in the apartment for a short time, that the fire had been a tragic accident, that no one could have foreseen it. Alexei looked at them and felt nothing but contempt. Where were they when the girls slept in the hospital, shaking with fear? Where were they when Sonia cried at night? When Anya was afraid of every slam of the door? When Olya couldn't sleep without his hand? But the court cared about something else. The law is harsh, but it is on the side of the biological parents, unless proven otherwise. "They don't love us," Katya said suddenly when she was called in for questioning. The judge frowned. "Why do you think that?" "Because if they did, they wouldn't have left us alone." "Do you want to go back to them?" Katya didn't look away. "Nobody. We have a daddy now." She turned to Alexei, and for the first time in the whole time of clutching his heart, he realized that no matter what happened, he wouldn't give up. The final session was the most difficult. Alexei's lawyer presented evidence. Reports on the fire, doctors' testimonies, psychologists' conclusions. The judge listened attentively. But the decisive moment was the night before the hearing, when Alexei received a phone call. "Do you think you know better than we do how to raise our children?" It was the voice of the girl's mother, cold, with some strange tinge of anger. "I think I do," Alexei answered calmly. "They're not yours. They're not yours either." She grinned. "Do you really think they love you? You're just a convenient substitute. Once we take them away, they'll forget you in a month." Alexei clutched the phone. "They don't want you. Kids don't know what they want. It's you who don't understand." He wanted to hang up, but at the last second, he heard another. "You're wasting your time." The next morning, the court ruled. The parents were denied reinstatement of parental rights. Alexei got full custody. When he got home, the girls rushed to him. Katya clung to him so tightly he could barely breathe. "Is that it?" she whispered. "That's it. They won't take us?" "Never." She sobbed and snuggled into his shoulder. And Alexei closed his eyes, feeling, for the first time in months, that they were really mine now. After the trial, everything changed. Alexei had expected that things would be easier, now that they were an official family. But he was wrong. Being a fireman turned out to be easier than being a father of 5 girls. In the first few days after the trial, problems began to arise that he had never encountered before. Olya began to fear he'd disappear. She would wake up at night, crawl into his bed, and put her arm around his waist and whisper, "You're not going anywhere, are you?" "Of course not, baby." But that wasn't enough. In the afternoon, when he left for work, she threw tantrums. Sonia, on the contrary, became quieter, as if she was afraid that now that everything was settled, he would change his mind. Anya became withdrawn. Masha started making chaos, checking where the boundaries were. And Katya tried to keep everything under control, as if she was afraid that if she relaxed, everything would collapse again. Alexei felt like he was losing control. One night, he stood on the balcony, looking out over the city, lit by the night lanterns. "Is it hard, Dad?" Katya stood in the doorway with her arms crossed over her chest. He grinned. "What do you think?" "I think you can handle it," she said confidently. He looked at her. "What makes you so sure?" She shrugged. You pulled us out of the fire, so you can handle it." Alexei looked at her and suddenly realized that if a 10-year-old girl could get through it all and not break, he could too. The next day, he decided it was time to make a change. He started talking to them more. Olya now knew that Daddy would always come back. He gave Sonya privacy, but every night he read to her before bed. Anya began to trust him when he just sat next to her, silent but close. Masha still wreaked havoc, but now he knew it was just her way of demanding attention. And Katya realized that she didn't need to be an adult now. One day, when Alexei came to pick them up from school, the teacher asked, "Are you sure you are their foster father?" "Yes," he answered, tensing up a little. "It's just, usually children in such families take a long time to get used to it. But yours, they love you." Alexei looked at his girls. They were laughing, chatting with each other, and when they saw him, they rushed towards him. He smiled. "I'm their daddy. For real." 3 years had passed. There was no silence in their home now. Every morning, a fight over the bathroom. Every evening, stories about school, laughter, sometimes tears. Sometimes Alexei remembered the day he carried them out of the fire. He had saved them then. But now he knew the truth. In fact, it was they who had saved him. It was a snowy winter. Alexei stood in the yard of his house, watching 5 girls, whom he had once rescued from a fire, running around the yard playing snowballs. To be exact, not girls, but girls. Katya, tall, with long blonde hair, was no longer the frightened girl who had once been 10. Now she was 17 and preparing for university. Anya, who had once been afraid of loud noises, was now going to be a musician. Masha, the same 6-year-old prankster who climbed closets, was now studying to be a sports coach. Sonya, who as a child hid things and didn't believe she had her own home, was now the most responsible. And Olya. Alexei always called her little girl. Though it was funny now, because she was already a teenager. But what hadn't changed was their tradition. Every winter, they built a snowman in the yard. "Dad," Katya shouted, "come here, or you're always looking from the side." Alexei grinned. "Do you think you can beat me?" He took a step forward, but at that moment a clod of snow flew at him. "Olya!" He was indignant, shaking it off. "What?" She laughed. "You taught us to strike first." And the snow battle began. In the evening they sat at the table. Katya raised her glass of compote. A toast. "Wow, now we have toasts too?" Alexei grinned. "Yes, because we've grown up." She looked at her sisters, then at him. To Daddy, to the man who wasn't afraid to take 5 girls and make us a happy family. Alexei swallowed the lump in his throat. "And to you," he added, "because it was actually you who saved me." They smiled, and in that moment he realized, even years later, despite all the difficulties, despite the doubts, he would make that choice again. Because for their sake, it was worth it.